it is true that I was involved in the Nexus assessment. Having said that, before that I was involved in the best values assessment, so maybe there is a little bit of a link. And importantly, the work that we are currently doing in TRANSPATH is linked to the questions of values and social norms. So that's why I'm standing here today, and I would like to talk a little bit about the issue of social norms and cultural narratives with respect to the transformative change assessment, but also with respect to the research we have been doing in TRANSPATH. So as you've already heard from Francisco and others, this time around in this presentation we'll be looking at this segment of the transformative strategies, looking at the questions of norms and narratives and how they can be leveraged in social transformations. And I'd like to bring in some questions that we have been asking in the Transformative Pathways project. So as you've already heard, social norms and cultural narratives are considered to be powerful tools to shift behaviors and to shift our operation. Having said that, it is also important to consider that cultural narratives and social norms are also nested in the broader system that we are operating in. So values and narratives are a part of more complex dynamics, and importantly, they play out very differently in different contexts. And that is exactly what we decided to have a look at in TRANSPATH. And we were wondering what we could learn about the role of values and narratives if we have a look at some specific examples of transformational change. So the specific example of transformative change that we picked for the research was the intersection between the energy sector and food sector, because these two sectors are currently going through quite abrupt changes in the European context. And we decided to have a look at the contrast, potential contrast, between Eastern European and Western European situation to see whether the transformative change in these two sectors plays out differently, and importantly, whether the role of norms and narratives is different in those two contexts. And I will try to present some preliminary results from the Eastern European case to see if we can have some interesting discussion around that. So the overarching question that we were posing was, how are social norms and cultural narratives embedded in broader, wider, and more complex transformative processes? So in this talk, when I'm referring to transformative processes, what I have in mind basically is looking at transformative change in a given sector, this time around food and energy sectors, and looking at how transformative change happens in those sectors. And just as a very broad example, I'll try to outline that if we are thinking about such a transformative change in those sectors, we can think about it, for instance, as a function of changes in legislation. We can trace those changes to different kinds of preferences by policymakers, and we can assume that these preferences are formed on the one side by different kinds of pro- and anti-transformative lobbying, and on the other side by the voters' pressure from the side of the electorate. Further on, we can assume that voters' pressure is a function of public opinion, and I think by now you know how this is going further. And this public opinion very likely is a function of whether people had a positive experience with changes in these sectors in the past. And quite naturally, that becomes a function of whether they have seen any transformative change in those two sectors in the past. And what we can see here, really as an example for the moment, is that we are closing a feedback loop in those dynamics. We can see that public opinion and values and narratives are a part of the broader picture, but this also tells us that we have to consider narratives and norms and values in the broader ecosystem of relationships. So let's have a look at a specific example how that played out in our research. So what we did in our research here is that we talked to a series of change makers from the energy and food sectors in the Czech Republic and in other Eastern European countries. And we went with them through a process of systems thinking and systems thinking exercises, which helped us to come to system diagrams, specifically, technically speaking, this is called fuzzy cognitive maps, of how they understand the transformative processes they have been a part of in those two sectors. So we have produced a number of these systems maps, and each of these maps is capturing how transformative change happens in the given sectors. And importantly, these systems diagrams then can be subject to additional layers of analysis. Specifically, we looked at which factors in those maps seem to be more central than others. We looked at what kinds of feedback loops are working in those processes. And importantly, we looked at how these different variables or factors of transformative processes play out if we try to look at how dynamically this system works. So this might come across as a little bit abstract. Let's have a look at a specific example. So after producing these maps of how transformative change works, and after the layers of analysis that I just described, we came across a list of factors which seem to be important in the transformative processes in the food and energy sectors. And I'll present a selection of them. And I think what is quite interesting is that first, you can notice that some of these transformative factors come as rather top-down, while others come as rather bottom-up. So among the top-down factors, we can see that political support, legislation, and both kinds of lobbying, pro-transformative and anti-transformative, play out as crucial. On the bottom-up side of the dynamics, you can notice that creating transformative initiatives and the influence of small actors has emerged as important in the systems map of transformative processes. Another important and here crucial group of factors were those ones that are related to norms and narratives. And you can see that on the one side, it was public support to transformation in general. Interestingly, it was the level of public conformity, how much we want to conform with others in our societies. It was the value of personal engagement in active citizenship, whether that is or isn't seen as a value in a given society, because not in all societies this is seen as a value. The cooptation or the capture of topics related to transformation, so the level to which greenwashing is becoming a norm in the given society, and human-nature relationships. So this was a group of factors that were closest to the questions of social norms and cultural narratives. But importantly, and I think this is the crucial message of this, they were not there in a vacuum. They were related to structural factors, such as people's purchase power, the level of decentralization of those two sectors, the availability of finance for transformative initiatives in the two sectors, and people's ability to meet their needs in not just monetary way, but also non-monetary way, meaning that when people were able to meet their needs in a non-monetary way, it gave them much more freedom to experiment and to behave transformatively in the systems. And what I would like to highlight is that this tells us that yes, it is crucial to talk about values and norms and narratives, but we have to realize that they are a part of larger ecosystem with much more tangible and let's say much more structural factors. So let me illustrate what we can learn from this systems approach about the influence of two factors, the public conformity on the one hand and the purchase power on the other side. So I've already mentioned that in the systems mapping, one type of result that we can reach is a so-called dynamic output. This means that we can learn how the different factors would behave if the system worked the way that is drawn in the systems map. And what you can notice here is this thicker blue line, which is telling us how the level of transformative change in the sector would play out in the given constellation of factors. You can see that in general, the current system seems not to be changing. It looks like the level of transformative change is actually equaling out at exactly the level where it was in the beginning. So basically, no profound change is happening. Interestingly, if we so-called turn off the factor of public conformity, if we weaken the way how much we are trying to conform with others, you can see that the transformative change level stabilizes higher than zero, meaning that this has a positive impact on how transformative change plays out. Quite the contrary, if we turn off the factor of purchase power, which was the one I was mentioning as one of the structural factors, you can see that the level of transformative change stabilizes lower than it was before. So through this kind of analysis, we can play with the different variables and we can have a look at what is their ultimate impact on the variable of our interest, which here is transformative change. So once again, as takeaways, I would like to once again emphasize that yes, values, norms, and narratives are a crucial part of the transformative change picture. Having said that, they are a part of a broader system of dynamics and interactions that can be seen as something that makes things more complex, but it can also be seen as something that is helpful, because that means that if we want to work with values and with narratives, we can actually enter that from a very non-narrative and non-value side of the system. For instance, if we follow the mechanisms that I was just describing, we can see that ways how to change norms and narratives can be related to social learning and observation. We can basically observe others, observe their behavior, and adopt some of the norms and some of the narratives that they have been showing us. We can promote new framings of problems. We can basically hire journalists to write things differently and frame problems slightly differently to offer people different kinds of narratives about the issues that we are living. Of course, different values and norms and narratives come with times of disruption and crisis. Those are moments when these change abruptly, but I'm assuming that that's not necessarily what we want to be a part of with the policymaking. In the previous presentations, we have already heard about how policies and institutional change can contribute to value change and to narrative change. And of course, we can highlight the role of grassroots movements as another mechanism that is bringing in to the society additional narratives and additional norms that might be novel to the given situation. So once again, I wanted to highlight that when we think about norms and narratives, we might want to think about them as a part of a broader picture, and that if we want to change norms and narratives, we can quite often start somewhere else and somewhere easier than digging into narratives and norms directly. Thank you very much.